Okay, true believers, we have made some metal. I'm going to switch the old metal off so it's out of the way. One of the things you can do with these folders is if you just click on them there, then you can collapse them, which, as you can imagine, doing this sort of stuff, this stack gets a bit ridiculous, so that's quite useful. Okay, so we're going to move on to wood. Have a look at some of the wood. I'm going to switch the metal off. And let's switch this wood on. There we go, nice warm brown wood. So if we open the wood up, we've got a few things going on. Let's switch them all off. See what we've got at the beginning. We may actually not need all of these. The wood's a bit more complicated in the sense that to try and get a decent looking wood, you've kind of got to have a bit of variety. In all honesty, it would kind of make more sense to just actually do a bit of painting, just to lay some foundations across this, to try and get some variation in the wood, but I didn't do it that way, so I'll show you what I did do. So as before, so with the wood we've got in here, I've got a colour selection, which is basically picking the red. So if I switched it to yellow, or added the yellow, then you can add more things into it. Let's get rid of that. So I'm using the red, and then on top of that I have a paint layer, and it was just that I was going in and just adding some extra details. I actually don't think I probably need it. In fact, I'll probably just get rid of it, because it was, oh no, I do need it. I'll tell you why I need it. This is why I needed it, because if you look in here, basically the way the bake has come through, it didn't catch some of this stuff, but it's not worth rebaking because I actually think it's coming from the 3D model. So if I undo that, you see how I basically went back in with a paint layer, and in fact I'll show you. So create, add, paint, and I don't need my alpha, I can just have a normal brush for this one. My brush is fine, and it's set to white, which is what I want. I can just sit and paint in the areas which have not got the wood coming through. And again, it's the same as before. Once this is up to 4K, this will all be a lot better. What have we got? We've got a base colour, which is just the brown, and it's got roughness. There's no metalness in this one, and I don't need a metalness channel for this because there is no metalness. The metalness is in this bit. I mean, I could add a metalness channel, but I just need to set it to not metal, and then everything above it will be not metal. It doesn't really make any odds either way. The next thing that's on top of it is this soft edge build up, and as you can see, let me turn that up a bit more so you can actually see what it's doing. Essentially, as before, I've got a lighter colour, kind of like we did with the metal, and I'm using in the mask editor, I'm using a bit of texture and a bit of my ambient occlusion and a bit of my curvature, all contributing together to make so it's curvature that's doing all the work as per usual. If we open curvature up, I'm blending from the edges, and I've just got a range of mainly the sharp end of things and not so much the big stuff, because the big stuff will flatten out the big areas, which we don't want. But I just wanted something that created a bit of variation for the wood, so it feels like there's some patternation to it. and obviously I just turned that right down so that it's only just coming through like that, so we end up with something which is quite subtle. There's no point in me remaking that because you've seen that stuff. If you've watched the metal video, you've seen that been done before already. So on top of that, I have some cracks. It's worth saying as well that I have grabbed this from, although I haven't followed it directly, but I went and had a look at some examples of wood, so I've kind of borrowed some colours and tried to get some ideas of how the arrangement of colours works. So I wanted to bring out some of the darker sections, but I wanted it to have a fairly painterly feel. So I've got this first one is these Occlusion Cracks. So if I just switch this off so we can just see what they're doing, you can see that it's actually quite subtle what we're getting there. And again, the way I'm doing that is I'm using a blur to basically blur out the result. So I switch that off, you can see it there, and it's a mask editor, and I'm just using curvature again, and I'm using cavities this time, so I'm in the cracks, working my way out, a range of things being changed to get the effect I'm after. Again, don't think I really need to go over that too much, you've seen that done before. To get this what is still quite a soft transition, but these I just wanted to soften them out even more. So what I did was I added a filter on top of this. So add a filter, and the filter I added was blur. And then the blur, you can set the intensity of the blur. You can blur it right out or not that much, but essentially did enough to kind of make it feel like it had a kind of like soft painted feel to it. So that compared with the white parts, which I want to pull down a little bit now, you get a sense of having a bit more form. Okay, so the next part on top of that is I wanted to try and create some wear, or not wear, well, a feeling of kind of like aging or wear or use or something across it. So I created this using a similar kind of mask to the one that's used on this soft edge build-up, but I just widened it out more so it covered more of the area. And then I used this is actually using a blue tint. In fact, if we turn it up, you can see it's over the top of it, and that's just because all of this stuff is really sort of brown and yellow, so I tried to pick it for it to be a kind of more shadow like, but to have a more like an opposite tone, just to kind of make it more interesting. So, which is always a nice trick to do if you're ever painting anything or doing anything like that, is if you kind of stick your shadows in as the opposite, like the right level of darkness but kind of the opposite colour that you want, then you can get something that's quite interesting. And it's something that's done with wood quite a lot. So I stuck with blue, but I turned the effect right down so that it's quite subtle, but again just gives a bit of variation in tone. And if you look at the mask, it's basically using curvature again, and if we go into here you can see that it's basically working from the cavities out. However, there's a lot more of the larger forms in here and less of the kind of, less of the sharp stuff. So yeah, so that basically went in over the top of that, try and create a bit more variation. And that's all it is, it's just subtly layering up these things, 4, 5, 6 layers of detail, basically getting you to the place you need to be. Okay, the next one on top of that is I wanted to work some edges in, some stronger edges. So that's what this one is. And that is just, again, base colour, just roughness set really, really high. And when the resolution of this goes up, this will go up as well. And if we look into the edge, the mask editor, then I actually used, I think this might have actually come from one of these smart masks originally, but essentially I edited it to bits. It's using a text, essentially using a texture to, and it's using the ambient occlusion and the curvature. So the ambient occlusion is more or less just, should be taking out some of the detail out at the edges, so it's harder to see, and the curvature is as before, it's working on the edges and it's focusing on mainly the sharp and the fine stuff to get really much sharper edge. All the big stuff and everything's gone. And then what I'm doing is I'm using a texture, this Grunge Rust Fine, just to kind of mix it up a bit and kind of vary the stroke a bit more. So you can see that in here. That's controlling the power of the texture. And then just to get it to punch through a bit more, like it's been painted on top, I added a sharpen, which just helps, you know, make it pop a bit more. And then you get it in these areas where, you know, this is obviously where I've sculpted in to the surface. It's kind of picked these micro details up. It's pulling all of that out using the sharpen. If I pull that back, it's less obvious, so it kind of gets you a little bit of, you know, again, more variation. So yeah, so that gets us to there. Then our old friend the gradient added on top. Again, I'm sticking with this idea of things in the shadows. I'm keeping kind of in that sort of blue area tonally, but this is not doing anything we haven't seen before. You know that it's you kind of know how all this stuff works. We've looked at it already, and if you looked at the metal one, it's in there. So this was literally just copied from the metal one and just played with a bit. It's set to multiply again, and again it's just pulled down a little bit just to. So the wood down at the bottom is very dark. This wood's not so dark. But it just makes it a little bit more interesting. And then above that, this is the first bit of hand painting I've actually done. Well, hand painting, it's a bit strong. Which is this. If we go into the mask, if I just switch the mask off for a minute, essentially I've filled it with this dark colour. It's basically black, and I've pulled the opacity of it down, and essentially I have painted in, in fact, I'll switch it off. I'll delete both of those so you can see what it is. So all I've done is, in fact, let me clear the mask. So what I've done is I've basically created a black mask, I've created a paint layer, and I've gone in with a soft brush. So brush, default soft, and I've painted in where I want to create a kind of ambient occlusion shadow. I control. And at 100% it looks like that. And then what I'm doing is I'll hit X to switch to the inverse of the mask, the black, and then I'm basically painting it back out again. The idea is if by doing things like this by hand, what you end up doing is you end up creating stuff that doesn't just follow the, it actually looks like it's been handmade. It doesn't just follow the, and obviously it looks rubbish like that, but if you then start to pull it back, you can start to get a kind of subtle gradient. Right. And actually what I did do with that is then I added a blur on top, so I painted it like that, and then added a filter, stuck a blur on it, and then controlled the amount it did with the blur, and then came back in here, pulled it back, and then did that around all the wherever the wood meets the surface. But what you can see is it just makes it pop a little bit more, just makes it pop out. Yeah, okay. So that's that. And as you can see, I've put it around everywhere, but it's just not done in a particularly even way. So it works quite well. And that was more or less it. That was me kind of up to finishing it. And then, but I didn't really like the colours too much, or I just thought they were still a bit too flat. So what I did do, rather than going back in and trying to add more layers, or I thought there was a good enough base there for something. So what I did was I added a colour balance on top, which got me this. Now if I switch that off, if I create a new one, just to show you. Now the way you do this is you can drop, this is a filter, and you can drop this directly into the layer, and then it behaves in a slightly different way I would do it any other way. So if I go to filters and I go to colour balance, there it is, and I drag that from there and I drop it in when that white line is there, that should drop it there, then I've basically got this colour balance channel. Now the colour balance inside this folder structure inside Wood is using this mode here, which is pass through, is the blending mode. Now this is not something that is maybe as common in Photoshop. Well, it is, but it affects all layers. Essentially the pass through passes through the information from all the layers or into the layers, so essentially it affects the whole stack, or in this case everything that's inside this folder. It basically has an effect on everything. It's not just the bit on the top. So it's kind of like so it basically behaves like in Photoshop like an adjustment layer. If you click, so it creates essentially the copy of all this sort of stuff, which is this bit you can see here, and then what it does is that's the old one, this new one. What it does is then has this filter in it. So if you click on the filter, you get to the properties, and what you can do is you can basically go in, and the only thing we want to affect is colour. In fact, that was already set up to just only affect colour, and then you can go in here and select the areas that you want it to affect. There's not going to be much in the highlight range because this doesn't really have much in the way of highlights. It's kind of like shadows through to mid-tones most of the way. So we'll start with the shadows, and essentially what we can do is we can push these more towards being cyan, maybe green and blue. And then maybe in the mid-tones we'll go the opposite way, we'll go for something which is more red. But just by adding that colour balance, we've essentially changed the tone. You can see how you can kind of make quite subtle changes to the look and feel of, and obviously with this you don't have to have it at 100% either. You can kind of overcrank it and then kind of work it back in to where you want, and you could also add a mask to this as well, so it has no effect on it. Set it to 100% pass through, and then actually go in and paint. Add paint, and I could set that to black, and I could paint where I don't want it. Paint where I do want it. So maybe I just want it to only affect the edges where it's nice and green. Get that green to come through a bit more. And I don't want it to affect the other areas, but you can see how you're getting a lot more tone out of it because of it. So that's quite cool. So I ended up using a colour balance to get it to there. And I could stick that on top of it. So you could even put colour balances on top of colour balances to get even more, more range in what you've got. So don't think you're just stuck with the colours. You can actually do quite a lot of editing on top to get them where you want them to be. Anyway, that's that. I can delete that, I think. That's pretty much wood. My wood sorted. I mean, I'll be doing some more stuff to it later on, but that's between the two things, there we are. We've got wood and we've got metal.